Today I'm going to try and recreate some of the iconic synth sounds of early Prince records. I think recreating sounds is a great way to understand how records are put together, and also a great way to learn about synthesis in general. The first thing to know about 80s era Prince is that he used the Oberheim OBXd a lot, and knowing what kinds of synths were used on a record is a great help in trying to recreate the sounds. The OBXd has got a really unique sounding filter that's been recreated in many synths of today, both hardware and software. So to make these sounds, I'm going to use what I personally think is the best Oberheim emulation plugin around, which is the OBXd by Disco DSP. This plugin sounds great to me and has the bonus of having a free version available, which I'll link in the description. So let's start by taking a listen to the sound I'm trying to recreate, which is the intro sound for Let's Go Crazy. So when I listen to a sound, I'm really listening for three main things. What pitches the oscillators are set to? Are they in unison or separated by an octave or a fifth or some other interval? What's the tone of the sound? Does it sound like it's been filtered, so it's got a dull sound to it, or is it a really bright sound? And lastly, what's the envelope of the sound? Does it have a plucky sound, or is it sustained, or is it somewhere in between? So I'm going to open up the OBXd plugin here, and this is the default sound. It's a pretty basic saw wave sound. So I'm going to start with the oscillators. So the sound off the record, it's got a definite organ-like quality to it, I think. And to me, that sounds like the oscillators are spread apart quite a long way. So let's try making oscillator 2 be an octave up from oscillator 1. So that's going to be 12 semitones, like this. Okay, that's a little bit more organy. Let's go up 2 octaves from oscillator 1. And immediately to me, just by setting those two oscillators 2 octaves apart, we're somewhere in the ballpark of the tonality of the sound. So what else is going on here? Let's experiment with the Detune a little bit. So the Detune is just going to shift those octave separations a little bit away from an octave, which can sometimes make it sound a little bit more lifelike. The other thing I'm going to try is turning on the rectangle waves as well as the saw waves. Just going to turn it down a bit there. Now what that allows us to do is experiment with the pulse width. And the pulse width is changing the actual shape of that rectangle wave. And when you change it, you can hear that we're adding in a whole bunch of different harmonics and overtones that allow you to really kind of dial in the tonality of that sound. And as I move that around, it starts to sound a little more organy or less organy. So I'm going to go somewhere around here. That sounds about right. So now let's listen to the filter and see what effect that has on the sound. So I don't think the filter's fully open. I think it's around here somewhere. And the other really important element of the Oberheim filter is what sound the resonance adds to it. So as I bring in the resonance, you can start to hear that you get all sorts of resonant sounds that can also make it sound a little bit more organy. So let's try and find somewhere in here that sounds about right. Let's listen to the original again. Okay, that's getting there. So the other thing to listen to is how the envelopes are working with the sound. And if I listen to the start of this, you can hear that there's a little attack sound at the very beginning of the note, which at the moment we don't have. So what we can do is bring up this envelope amount and add some decay into the filter envelope. And that that will start to add a little attack sound to the beginning of the note. And it's probably a little bit too much. Don't need very much. But you can really hear it when there's this slide part. It really needs that attack sound. If I take that off, it's a very different effect. So we'll add a little bit of envelope modulation into the filter. That's starting to sound pretty good. So the other really important part of this sound is the vibrato. There's a lot of wobble going on there. A vibrato can sometimes be a little bit confusing to work out what's going on, but the way I think about it is, does it sound like a kind of warbly sound, or does it sound like an angular wobble? And if it's warbly, then it's probably a sine wave modulation, and if it's angular, then it's probably a square wave modulation. So in this case, it's pretty warbly, so I'm going to turn on the sine wave modulator, and I'm going to send that to oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. And you can start to hear it really wobbling those around. So let's try and dial that in to get it pretty close to the record. That sounds pretty good to me. Yeah, maybe a little bit too much. I'm also going to turn on the pulse width modulation. Now if I overdo this, you'll hear it really starts to move that square wave around, but I'm just going to have a very little bit of it just to give it a little bit more modulation. Okay, let's see how we're doing. Here's the original, and here's the recreation. I think that's getting pretty close. Now, the other thing to bear in mind with all these records is you've got the sound of the synth, but then it's been mixed, you know, through a console and some effects, and then it's probably been mastered afterwards. So getting the synth patch right is kind of only half the battle. Now, I think that that's probably about as close as I can get within this plugin, but we can probably add some other things to make it sound a bit closer to the record. So the first thing that I noticed is that the record sounds a lot brighter. So I'm going to add a little bit of EQ into here. I'm going to close this window for a sec, and we're going to put on a little bit of a high shelf EQ here. And I'm also going to send it to this delay effect. Now, I'm not entirely sure what effects Prince would have had available in the 80s, but I did find reference to this one box called the Lexicon Delta T. This is a pretty basic delay unit by modern standards, but it effectively allowed you to have two different delay settings on the left and the right channel. So what I've done is I've added a Valhalla delay plugin, which I'm sending on a send effect, and I've got a 72 millisecond delay, and I've spread it by 6 milliseconds, which basically means it's going to be 72 milliseconds minus 6 on one side and 72 milliseconds plus 6 on the other side, which is similar to what this Lexicon unit did, I believe. So if we add in a little bit of that, it sounds like this, which starts to get us in the ballpark. And the other thing that I noticed when I listened to the record is it sounds like there's a subtle chorus effect over the whole sound. And again, not knowing exactly which effects were used, but I'm guessing it was something like the Roland Dimension D. That was a pretty standard chorus effect that would have been available in the 80s. So I'm adding a little bit of the Dimension D, and that makes it sound like this. So that's with the Dimension D. That's without. That's with. And just for good measure, I'm going to add a little bit of this FabFilter Saturn 2. That's just adding a little bit of drive in the mid-range, which maybe kind of emulates what might have happened if it was recorded to tape. So let's see how that all sounds together. That's starting to sound pretty good. So I think that's about as close as I can get it. Let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed this sound recreation, and I'll see you next time.